Throughout the scriptures, we hear the imagery of gardens and farming and agriculture used over and over again as ways to help the people then, and hopefully us now as well, to understand the down-to-earth reality of God's grace. In the passage that we join together to share in the call to worship from Isaiah, we hear God saying that you will be like a watered garden. And we think again of the waters of our baptism. The Lord will provide for you even in parched places, and you will be watered like a spring of water that won't run dry. Beautiful imagery for God's people who, despite difficulties or hardship or the sense that God is far away, still God reminds them. And in this case, in the case of the latter chapters of Isaiah, they've been for more than a generation in exile in Babylon, far, far from home. And yet God promises them that they will be like a watered garden. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the imagery of the garden in the creation story. And after God has created all that is, including Adam and Eve, there's a sense of the gift of the garden that God the Creator places the first human beings in the garden, which is full of fruit. And God commands those to be fruitful and to multiply and to be stewards, to have dominion, to care for the garden. And we know that story didn't turn out all that well. But still, the beautiful imagery of the garden that we know so well. And throughout the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, we hear imagery of gardens coming up over and over again. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Psalm 23 and the beautiful pastoral imagery. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me into green pastures beside still waters. Beautiful scenery. Multiple times in the Gospels, we hear Jesus talking about gardens, telling stories about gardens, telling the story about a vineyard owner who very carefully planted the vineyard, that grew a hedge around it, that put a vine press in it. And then when the owner came back to see how those that had rented out, the tenants, were doing, the owner's servants and messengers were beaten and ultimately killed. The imagery of God's creation entrusted to the care of the stewards and the tenants. And then there are those images from the very last part of the Bible, and I'm going to read these to you directly from the book of Revelation in chapters 21 and 22, and this is from the New Revised Standard Version, the Children's Edition. Beginning with chapter 21, I spoke a week or so ago about John and the revelation about the lives of the churches that had been started in Asia. And here, the revelation to John tells us, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'See, the home of God is among mere mortals, and God will dwell with them, and they will be God's people, and God will be with them.'" And then in the next chapter, the first few verses, chapter 22, "Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life. Again, this beautiful imagery of the living, moving water. Bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the city. And on either side of the river is the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. The leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Well, what if we see ourselves as part of God's amazing, wonderful garden? What if, in fact, we are connected with that tree of life that is watered by the abundant living waters? What if we are connected root and trunk and branch, that we are fed by that sap that flows back and forth within the tree and down to the tips of the smallest leaf? And what if we here at St. Paul's might think of ourselves as just one of those leaves on that tree of life? The vision from Revelation says that the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. That's a very, very tall order, right? The leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. There's beautiful imagery in the leaves. I don't know if you've seen these patterns, but the way in which the veins on a leaf oftentimes mimic the branches of the tree. And the branches of the tree often mimic the roots of the tree. And you can see that exact same pattern in the blood vessels in our human body. Over and over again, we see these beautiful branching patterns. You can see it in river systems around the world, this same kind of branching pattern. And so there's this deep sense of interconnectivity, of deep sense of being part of this amazing, wonderful creation, as I said. What if we are just one of those leaves of the tree of life that's so profoundly, deeply nurtured and nurturing for the healing of the nations? Well, I think that's always been a very, very tall order throughout any of our lifetimes, throughout any of human existence, and it seems perhaps now more than ever, it seems like a daunting challenge if we are meant to be the leaves that bring about the healing of the nations. How are we to do that? Us few here online together, here in person, mere mortals, limited human beings, limited in our abilities, our knowledge, our capacity. And yet, that is the invitation to us. And so I think we're invited through our baptism to live into what it might mean for us to be a leaf on the tree of life, bringing about the healing of the nations. Certainly in our world today, we know that healing is needed more than ever, whether it's climate change and all the impacts that it has, whether it's violence around the world and certainly in Ukraine and Russia, in the Middle East, in other areas around our world. It seems daunting and overwhelming, right? Within our own nation, it seems like we're more divided now than perhaps we've been in generations and generations. And tribalism and otherism seems to be stronger now than ever. What would it look like for us to be part of the healing of our nation? Well, again, I think that's a very, very tall order, and it's very, very easy to become completely overwhelmed and therefore paralyzed, and to think there's nothing we can do that will make a drop of difference when we see it in terms of the whole world. But what if we start very small and very local. You know that old saying, think globally and act locally? So what if we were to try and envision that? What might that look like? And over this past week, I've been thinking about that quite a bit, and so I was online looking at satellite and aerial photos of this immediate area right here. And guess what? On those aerial photos of Milwaukee, or the Google Map images, or even the Zillow images, you can zoom down to the point where you can very, very clearly see the outline of St. Paul's United Methodist Church. You can even see some of the stripes in the parking lot. You can very clearly see the community garden, the 30-some plots that individuals grow food, and then there's 2 others where together community members grow food for the larger community. How many of you are familiar with the Milwaukee Community Garden? I think this is the 12th year now, and I think, Gail, you might have been part of helping to establish that initially, right? And while some of the gardeners have maybe cycled through the years, the mission, the purpose of that garden has remained, and so people clearly nurture their own produce there in the garden. How many of you know that twice a week, surplus produce is provided to local food banks? Twice a week. So it's not just that they're growing produce for themselves, but for the larger community. And St. Paul's Church took a wonderful, beautiful step towards healing of the nations in recent weeks in replacing the old rickety, splintery play structure with a new, much stronger, sturdier, what we hope will be long-lasting. In fact, as Dan Boone said, what will be the strongest and last the longest, that was his vision. So we have a beautiful redwood structure, and we're excited to see that children are already playing on it, and especially helpful for the gardeners with children, because their children can play right close by, immediately in their view. And so it's a beautiful testimony, a beautiful witness to what it looks like for a congregation like St. Paul's to be involved in the work of the healing of the nations with open arms, welcoming others. And if we were to begin to zoom out our focus, if we started just with those 30 garden plots, that is an incredible way to be healing of the nations. And then if we zoomed out perhaps to the entire property here at St. Paul's, not quite, but close to 3 acres. And if you go on to the Clackamas County tax lot map, it tells you what the estimated value is of the property. Now, fortunately, as a non-religious nonprofit, we don't pay property tax. But the estimated value of the facilities and the property is somewhere close to $3 million. Imagine that, close to 3 acres, close to $3 million entrusted to our care. So what does it look like for us to be that leaf that's part of the healing of the nations and to utilize and steward this resource for the healing of the nations? Well, one of the beautiful ways that we've been doing that is through growing relationship with different neighbors, and especially in recent months with Spanish-speaking neighbors represented by the group of moms whose children have attended the Lott Whitcomb School just a mile east of here. And over the last several months, we've had a number of events here at St. Paul's where we hosted members of the Madres de Corazón, the Mothers of Heart group. We hosted their first in-person gathering in over 2 years due to the pandemic. We hosted them in the middle of the spring. We hosted the very first, as far as we know, presentation on mental health offered in Spanish in Clackamas County that was hosted here in May. And just yesterday, we hosted an event here focused on physical well-being. But again, it wasn't the madres turning inward to simply take care of themselves. It was actually a fundraiser for St. Jude's Hospital. And they raised several $100s, with all of those giving their time and energy to create a wonderful, welcoming event and experience of healing and community amongst the participants, and raising funds to help heal others that they probably will never know or see or know the benefit of. And so certainly we are utilizing the resources entrusted to our care to bring about the healing of the nations. And many of you may recall the story, but I think it's worth recalling because perhaps some of you don't recall how it came about that among the 30 or so gardeners participating in the Milwaukee Community Garden here at St. Paul's this season, that 3 of them are among the Spanish-speaking families related to the Madres de Corazon. And it's really, in my mind, just an amazing flow of grace how that came about, this cascading sense of living water as we've seen on the videos and as we see here in the fountain today, how one thing led to another and led to another and led to another. So, one contact with a couple of the staff at Lott Whitcomb School, Annie Schlegel, and Brooke Scheffelbein, I think is her name, part of the staff there. And they, in turn, introduced us to the Madres. And then through another connection, through our ecosystem of cooperating churches, getting to know the family resource coordinators that several of us met with in February, talking with the Madres about their interest and finding out that even though the garden has been operating here in this place for over 12 years, that all of the information about the garden, the registration forms, the information about volunteering, the list of what to grow and what not to grow and how to go about it, that for those 12 years, they'd only ever been available in English, even though obviously there are other non-English speaking people around the area who might appreciate the opportunity to participate. And it was through this amazing cascading of relationships and connections that one of the family resource coordinators, who works with families of young children in our area that we had just gotten acquainted with, volunteered to translate those documents from English into Spanish, making it possible for the Spanish-speaking participants to register and be involved. And one of our members heard that story and made some funds available to buy gift cards so they could acquire plants. And through other connections with other churches, more plant starts became available. And again, it's just a cascading experience of God's grace flourishing and flowing. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Interestingly enough, it's not just simply us, though, as St. Paul's, right? If we were to zoom out even farther and begin to take in maybe the boundaries of the city of Milwaukee, or maybe even all the way from the Willamette River, say, to I-205 to Clackamas Town Center, or even farther taking in the entire North Clackamas School District. We know that we are actively involved with a community of congregations, and we're going to be celebrating that connection about a month from now at North Clackamas Park next to the Milwaukee Community Center. On Sunday the 18th, I think we're up to at least 5 congregations now that will be a part of the Sunday morning celebration, of sharing stories with one another, of breaking bread with each other, of sharing not only the strengths of individual leaves of the tree, but now we're looking at maybe branches of the tree with several leaves involved. So for the first time, Milwaukee Kairos UCC will be a part of that experience together with other congregations. And Creator Lutheran, that's out in Happy Valley on Sunnyside Road, along with Milwaukee Lutheran and King of Kings Lutheran and St. Paul. So a growing community of congregations. And whereas for just one smaller congregation, we can say like, well, what could we possibly do to impact the surrounding area? Milwaukee, North Clackamas School District, what can we do? But it's amazing when we begin to connect up, to link up, to collaborate with a community of communities, with a congregation of congregations. It's amazing the work that God has for us to do and the shared capacity to do that work together. And that's why I hope for the second year that St. Paul's will be a part of this larger work, this larger Portland Metro-wide work in Multnomah and Washington and Clackamas counties of now not just a handful, but now maybe 30 or 40 or more congregations throughout our larger metro area, all together exploring and reflecting and sharing and supporting each other with this question: how do we make the best use of all that God has entrusted to us to help nurture healthy, thriving communities? How do we make the best use of everything entrusted to our care to nurture healthy, thriving communities? And together with my colleagues, other leaders here in North Clackamas County and throughout the Tri-County area, I believe that this is the work that God has called us to. I know that many of you have contributed in many ways to stewarding this property. And in the 2+ years that I've been here, I'm continually amazed at all the incredible stewarding, the work of the trustees specifically, but even more broadly, the congregation. I mean, there are many, many, many church facilities that I'm aware of that have not been maintained nearly as well as this facility. And when something happens, when the roof leaks, when there's damage in the nursery, when the parsonage roof and siding need to be replaced and the windows reset and the furnace system here that serves this part of the building needs to be replaced, over and over again, you all step up. Or like Dave Schmidt and Mike Smiley, going all through the building, finding lights and circuits that aren't working and finding hidden timers and replacing fixtures and installing thermostats. It's an amazing job that you all have done stewarding this wonderful facility and resource. And that's been especially affirmed this past week. Hopefully you've heard about or seen about, and you're certainly welcome to walk down the hall after worship today to room 7 and see a whole lot of stuff piled in there. And you might wonder, what's all this stuff doing in there? And I can tell you that stuff belongs to a particular program that's part of the Claremont School of Theology, the only Methodist seminary west of the Rockies, that's based primarily in Southern California, in Claremont, east of downtown Los Angeles, but is kind of branching out into the Northwest. And one particular center, the Process Work Institute, is now based here in Milwaukee because the director of that program, Andrew Schwartz, recently moved with his family into the house a few blocks from here where his father grew up. Beautiful connections, things that I certainly couldn't have envisioned or caused to happen And yet, this is what I believe, is that when we put ourselves in the position to be open and receptive and responsive to the opportunities, that we can cross that threshold and we can be available to be a part of the healing of the nations. I can say for sure that none of us who started the conversations with the Madres back in January, over 6 months ago, had any idea that it would result in a community garden or a fundraiser for St. Jude's Children's Hospital. But that's how God works in us and through us and with us when we're open and available and responsive to the flow of God's grace. And so I give thanks for that, and I ask us to all have open minds and hearts and spirits to be sensitive to, aware of, to what that next step might be, what the next opportunity might be. As it happens, this afternoon following worship, 2 of the North Clackamas School District board members are coming here to visit the church and talk with me because they've heard about what St. Paul's has been doing recently. And they're celebrating that. And my question for them will be, so where have you seen the greatest pressures on the lives of staff and students and families? How have those pressures been intensified with the pandemic? And then how might a congregation, a faith community like St. Paul's, or a group of faith communities like this group that I'm describing, how might we come alongside and make a difference in their lives? And we know that's already happening. We know it happened for many years with the Backpack Buddies program, that it's happened with the gift card program at Wichita Center. It's happened more recently with helping to purchase snacks for Lot Whitcomb. And we hope soon, with school coming back together, purchasing some books, particularly books in other languages besides English, for students at Lot Whitcomb to use. So we know the doors are opening. And I think if we have this attitude of expectation and anticipation and preparation and receptivity, God will indeed use us to do God's work, to be part of the tree of life, watered by the water of life, being the leaves that bring about the healing of the nations. Thanks be to God. Amen.